Hello, and welcome to part two of the book summary Seven Principles of Making Marriage Work. Today, I wanted to focus on another part, which I mentioned in the first video, which is specifically around conflict resolution and digging into that a little bit deeper. So, first, a quick overview. It'll be talking about it in three parts. So, the first part is around how do you raise needs. The second bit is around identifying repair attempts. And the third bit is Armageddon. What are behaviors that are really not helpful and really harmful in relationships? So the first bit is really around raising needs and how to do that. And kind of reiterating the point I made in the first video is that it's really, really critical to raise needs or things that you're unhappy with or that are making you grumpy, etc., etc. Kind of, I think in the romanticism of relationships, we often can get lost in the idea that, but you're supposed to be able to read my mind, you're supposed to be able to know. But a lot of times, our significant others or our friends or our family, they just don't know. So rather approach it from the perspective that they don't know. Right. So the idea around raising needs, so the way the Gottmans phrase it is around softening the startup. So that means that absolutely go do it, but the way that you approach the conversation has a massive impact on how it actually ends up going. So they call it softening the startup. And that's why I used a feather to kind of say soften. So the first bit is so there's a couple of tips. So the first one is to share responsibility. So when you're raising something, to say, listen, I might have made some mistakes here too, and maybe I should have raised this before, or I didn't communicate this particularly well, but I wanted to talk about X, Y, and Z. So if you started with already owning a part of your responsibility in the specific issue you're trying to raise, then it feels like shared responsibility, not that you're pointing towards another person completely. That's part one. The second bit is around kind of feelings language, to talk about feelings, but talk about them in the context of your own feelings. So to say, I feel this. So the kind of opposite of that is saying, like, you made me angry and you made me upset and you. That language can be quite triggering and quite upsetting for somebody else. So rather being like, I felt angry, I felt upset, this really got to me, starting from a place of ourselves, that's a way more helpful starting point. So, first, we want to own responsibility, and second, we want to kind of approach it from how do I feel, and it's I language. Then the third thing is that it's really helpful to speak about a specific situation. So to approach somebody and be like, we're always late and it's because of you, that's not particularly helpful. A more helpful approach would be, listen, last week, Saturday, we were late to my family function and I felt really upset about that because we could have been on time, but I was waiting for you and this particular incident really upset me. So being very specific about the thing that we're addressing really helps. And we'll loop back to that later on around the kind of four horsemen of the apocalypse. So you want to kind of be really specific about to say, I'm talking about this particular behavior, this particular instance, this is what happened, and this is how I felt about it. And the third part is kind of then also saying, like, what did I actually need in that situation? Like, what do I need for this to have a different outcome in the future? So this could be, in the example I just made around, I really don't like being late, is like, I need to feel like we're a team and I need, for us to be able to show up at the same time or something, or on time. That need might be different. But it's about raising needs. So, to summarize, we can soften our startup by sharing responsibility, by expressing feelings using I language, by addressing a specific situation, and by expressing what we need or what I need specifically. So, those are ways we can basically start the conversation and set ourselves up for success, hopefully, because it's easier to receive feedback in this particular manner. The second piece is around in having these conversations, which take a lot of courage, they're not that easy to do, which needs to be acknowledged at the outset, is that in that conversation, what we really want to be good at is we want to be able to identify when somebody is trying to make repair attempts. So when they're trying to kind of reach back and trying to meet us halfway in whatever way, shape, or form. So repair attempts can look in different ways. So the first bit kind of speaks to what we spoke to previously. So if somebody is speaking about their emotions and they're speaking about it from their own perspective, that could be a form of a repair attempt. The second piece could be around expressing gratitude to say, I was upset about A, B, C, and D, but I acknowledge that, the week before we were on time and that you showed up, or something like that. Like expressing gratitude and seeing the good in the other as a way to express a repair attempt. The third piece is around sharing or taking responsibility in any way, shape, or form. So if somebody's saying, I'm sorry, or I can see that that was my part of the problem, or something like that, those are all ways that somebody is ultimately making a repair attempt. Then it's around, a specific need being raised. So somebody saying, I needed you to be in my corner, or I needed you to have my back, or I needed you to hold my hand, or just I needed you to tell me I loved you. I love you. All of those are ultimately repair attempts because the other person is kind of trying to tell us, give us a guidance on what we could do that could kind of lead to a better outcome in the future. And the last one is a willingness to meet you halfway. So this could be something like, I can see where you're coming from. I see your point of view. I understand what you're saying. Any of those sorts of words is ultimately trying to come towards each other. So to summarize repair attempts, and the reason that these are really critical is that when we're having these really difficult conversations, we want to kind of hang on and focus on the moments where somebody is coming back towards us, because ultimately we've disconnected and we've broken some sort of connection. And in this conversation, we're actually trying to mend that. So when somebody's coming towards us, we want to be really, really good at identifying that. So to summarize, to identify repair attempts, 5 ways to identify them is like, if you're having feelings, this is how I feel, gratitude, responsibility, needs, and openness. And I've put some examples here of what those looks like. Then I'm doing a little bit of a side note on the concept of compromise and how to meet this. And I think that Gottman spoke about this really well in the book, around, like if both of us have circles, the light circles are things that are acceptable, that we can live with, things that we are okay to be flexible on. And the dark circles are the things that are non-negotiable. And I think that in having these negotiations of being like, what are your needs and what are my needs? And how do we meet somewhere in the middle where both of our needs get met? And we're kind of clear on that, is to kind of find solutions in which we're kind of in the zone that we are okay to be flexible on, and that we're not getting into a zone where one of us is getting into, this is non-negotiable for me, actually this is unacceptable, because that kind of builds resentment and that's not a good time. So once again, we want to get into that zone where it's like, like, I'm happy to, whatever we are amazingly creative human beings, so we can come up with alternative and interesting solutions that work for us as couples, as individuals, as friendships, etc., etc. But you want to kind of find something that works for you. So let's say, I hate being late, but I'm okay to be like, okay, 15 minutes before the time, I'm going to remind you. Like, I can live with that, and you can live with me doing that, as an example. Or but maybe that's not an acceptable solution because, I don't want to feel like I'm your mom. So maybe that's not acceptable. Maybe it's something else. And maybe this acceptable solution is that we drive separately so that I can arrive on time and you can arrive whenever you're ready. There is so many different options. And I think that ultimately we want to get into that realm where we're in a world which we both can live with. So another side note, which I think is really critical, is that in conflict, we can activate our fight and flight response, which is a side note and a separate video, which I will do at some point. But that really means like your heart rate gets really high, you get really focused, and it's ultimately like your body is responding if you're being faced by a tiger. And in that state, it's very easy to become super judgmental. It's really easy to, kind of have extreme responses. Either you fully shut down and you stop listening to your partner, or you can get super aggressive, or like super passive, or there's a whole range of like quite extreme responses. And it's really helpful to reflect for yourself, like, when I'm in a really stressful situation, what's my default? Do I get really aggressive? Do I get really angry? Do I shut down? How do I respond? But in those moments, kind of what is quite helpful to agree kind of you nearly want to talk about how you're going to fight before you have a fight or while you're at peace. um in those moments, like when you're having that moment and you're like really getting into it and you can see that you're getting to a break point, because often, or I find that for myself, when you get into that point, you're going to say things you might regret, or you're going to behave in ways that might not be helpful and that will require some repair later on. So it could be really helpful to kind of take a break, to be able to identify, okay, now we're both really triggered. This isn't working anymore. Let's take a break. My kind of 2 cents I'd add to that is to say I think it's super helpful to take a break. I think it can also be really helpful to agree how long that break's going to be, because that also can give both parties kind of comfort. Yes, we're taking a break, but we will come back together in the conflict resolution process. So to agree, maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 20 minutes, maybe it's 24 hours, but to say, right now, let's take a moment, let's regulate our nervous systems again, and then we'll come back and engage when we're ready. Now, we kind of spoke about the positive behaviors, quote unquote, that you want to do when you're raising difficult issues. And kind of the opposite of that is like, what are the four behaviors, which the Gottmans call the four horsemen of the apocalypse, that you really don't want to engage in? Because when you do that, that kind of really breaks trust and it can really shatter relationships in various ways. So we have the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which I think is really hilarious. So this is kind of Armageddon. This is and it's interesting because it's just specific behaviors that are really unhelpful. So, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So, the first is criticism. And I think it's interesting to separate criticism from kind of feedback. And criticism, like the way to conceptualize it is it's a global complaint, which expresses a negative feeling or opinion about the other person. So, this could be something like, oh, you're always late, or you're super messy, or you don't care about this, or something like that. Any of those things express kind of like this is how you are as a human being, as a complete human being. Um, but that kind of if that kind of feels like an attack, like an arrow being flung at you, but like a verbal arrow. So what we spoke about earlier around like a soft startup is a local complaint that's very specific and very factual. So kind of the first horseman is criticism, and criticism is like a global complaint, which kind of says this is how you are as a human being. The the thing that often comes with criticism is defensiveness. And defensiveness is kind of interesting behavior because that's kind of like you shut down and you're like, I'm not responsible for anything, and it's actually your fault that I'm behaving in this way. So it's kind of like blaming the problem on the person that's raising it, not kind of taking any sort of responsibility. So it's kind of like, in some popular culture, it's kind of like playing the victim, being like, oh, but I have nothing to do with this. And once again, the positive opposite of this would be to take responsibility, to say, if there's a conflict and something's going wrong, there's always two parts of it. Everyone has a little bit of responsibility in that situation. So it's kind of owning that piece of the puzzle. The third horseman, which I think is actually the most important to be aware of, is contempt. And contempt means communicating in any way, shape, or form that you feel like you're better than the other person. And I think this is really interesting because as human beings, we are super different. Like fundamentally, we have the same DNA, or we're very similar, but we are also so nuanced and different and interesting. And I think that's a beautiful part of the human condition. Um, but what's interesting is that often when we get grumpy with somebody because they're different to us, our response can be that I look down on you because my way is better than your way. And because my way is better than your way, then that makes me quote unquote right and it makes you quote unquote wrong. Now, while it can make us feel better about ourselves, speaking from experience, it doesn't necessarily lead to very healthy relationships. Um, so, yeah, content can look like lots of things. It's like rolling your eyes, name calling, mocking, hostile humor. All of that kind of is in any way if you communicate and I'm better than you and I'm putting you down. That's kind of contempt, and that like really corrodes trust in a relationship. Because for a relationship to function, we are need to look each other in the eye and see each other as equals. And as soon as there's contempt, we kind of really break that down, which is not that helpful. And the last one is called stonewalling. So this is kind of the shutdown response. If you're having a conflict or you're having a fight and somebody completely shuts down, like they're not responding anymore, they don't say anything, they just like they've got this like massive wall up around them. So this could be me, no eye contact, no feedback, no answer. And ultimately it feels like, I don't care what you're saying, I don't care, I don't want to listen. Um, and here once again, it's like when that's happening, when you're in that shutdown mode, you must probably in kind of fight and flight, or you're in what I think the Gottmans call emotional flooding. So you must probably need to take a step back and take some time, like the break that we spoke about previously. So those are like the four horsemen. So basically, like in a fight, it's very useful to be like, what are, you know, I don't know, I think we're all slightly imperfect. And it's useful to be like, which of these do I default to when I'm pissed off or when I'm mad? And what do I do very easily? And to try and kind of identify that for yourself, and to talk about it with the partner or a friend or something if you're raising issues, to be like, oh, this is how I behave and this is how you behave, and both knowing that these are our weaknesses, so we can catch each other and ourselves in future conflict resolution, which is kind of interesting. So that's kind of a summary. I think there's probably a lot more one can say about repair. Maybe that's part three to come at another point in time. But yeah, I would be really curious on your thoughts. Do you think this is helpful? Do you think it could help you in your conflict? Do you have anything to add? Would love to hear what you think. And thank you for watching. I hope you have a lovely day. Cheerio.